Streaming. And just waiting on. Okay, looks like we're ready to go. Okay, so uh, back here with Jeff, and we are going to talk this week about Zizek's another Zizek book called Living in the End Times. Okay, looks like we're ready to go. Oops. Okay, so back here. Okay, Jeff, take it away.
Okay, so this is a 2010 book. He's talking about the end times of capitalism here. And 10 years on, it still seems to be capitalistic times. So it's getting old. But we'll see. He does say a few things that are pretty interesting. So we're going to start off today. We're going to do half the book, and then we'll do the rest of it next time. So he starts off by asking the question, how was it that the euphoria after the fall of the Berlin Wall changed into the re-election of ex-communist leaders a few years later? And Zizek's answer is that what people thought that the Second World wanted, meaning the old communist world wanted, was freedom and democracy, when what the people really wanted is socialism with a human face. And this is what he claims that all people everywhere really want. Socialism with a human face. They just don't often know how to express it, or that in fact means what they want. So Western-style liberal capitalism did not deliver, and that fact will soon be clear to even the most capitalist, he claims. So the underlying premise of this book, and here's what it looks like: Living in the End Times, Slavoj. The underlying premise of the book is a simple one. He claims the global capitalist system is approaching an apocalyptic zero point. And he likes to throw in a few Christian references there. So it's an apocalyptic zero point. Its four riders of the apocalypse are comprised of the ecological crisis, the consequence of the biogenetic revolution, imbalances within the system itself, such as problems with intellectual property and forthcoming struggles with over raw materials, food, and water. And fourth, the explosive growth of social divisions and exclusions. These, he claims, are what are bringing the capitalist world to an end, and we are living in its end times. Now, for Zizek, when he says zero point, it often has two connotations, as we saw last time with the zero level of violence. In this case, the zero point has, the first meaning is when there is nothing left of capitalism. And he means the good part of capitalism. So Zizek, like Marx, has a grudging admiration for capitalism. And he quotes from the Communist Manifesto, which he says has put, and he's referring to Marx didn't talk about capitalism as such. He spoke about the bourgeois style and all that stuff, but it's essentially capitalism. And so capitalism has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, and during its rule of scarce 100 years has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. That's in his mind, and my reading of him is that he actually admires, and Marx did too, capitalism's productive potential or productive forces.
Right.
It's done more, right?
Right. Because the caricature of Marxists is that they hate the rich, they hate capitalism, but really, Marx and Marxists see it as a progressive stage in history.
Yes.
Just that it has outlived that stage now.
Exactly, and that's essentially what he believes. Our style of capitalism has also reached that end point, and we're living in its end times. So all the evils of capitalism are on the verge of overcoming any good, and when there is nothing good left in capitalism, it will have reached its zero point. So that's the first thing he means. Like anything that good that came out of it, we were able to feed 7 billion, 8 billion people, where 100 years ago we couldn't have. We could feed the fewer people not less well than we feed our current people in the world. So that he sees as a good thing. We want to actually feed people. Now,
Yeah.
The second is When an individual hits rock bottom, this is the second meaning of the 0 point. When they pass through their dark night of the soul, when the only way up or the only way forward is up, you've hit the 0 point. And he's going to speak, and he's speaking of this in terms of capitalism as a society and as individuals. We need to go through the 0 point before the revolution can happen, essentially. So, continuing on, this is a quote from Zizek. And I should also point out that anything I say here is I'm acting as if I were Zizek, trying to defend him. Some of the stuff that I may say here may not be politically the best thing for me to say.
Right. Okay. So, fair. Yeah.
The most basic coordinates of our awareness will have to change. Insofar as today, we live in a state of collective fetishistic disavowal. We know very well that this 0 point will happen at some point, but nevertheless, we cannot bring ourselves to really, really believe that it will. And the truth hurts, and we desperately try to avoid it. I'm reminded of many examples of this, where people say they believe in something, and then they act very differently, showing in fact that they're quite hypocritical. It's all around us. Especially anybody who considers the environment something that needs to be saved and still drives a car, a gas-powered car, as an example, or somebody who thinks that animal cruelty is bad but continues to eat meat. It's a lot.
That's me.
Yeah, well, yeah. So this is a fetishistic disavowal, is what Zizek is saying, and everybody has it to some degree or another. I mean, there might be some more woke people than others, but in our society, we are all fetishistically disavowing, and specifically about capitalism. So the first reaction, the truth hurts and we desperately want to avoid it. This is basic psychology. So Zizek takes advantage of a schema that was developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of the grief system. You've heard of these, perhaps? The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Yep.
Yes. So there's 5 chapters in this book. They each deal with one of these stages of grief. So to illustrate the point, he goes on to say that the way our society, our social consciousness attempts to deal with the forthcoming apocalypse is through the same stages of grief. The first reaction is one of ideological denial. There is no problem. There's no disorder. What are you talking about? And, we've heard lots of people say that about all 4 of those things, right? The second is exemplified by explosions of anger at the injustices of the New World Order. And we see this with riots and stuff like that at every level and in pretty much every continent. The third involves attempts at bargaining. So if we changed a little thing here or a little bit there, life could perhaps go on as before. That's a type of bargaining, and so we see this in politics all the time.
So reformism, almost.
Yes, he would say that is, in fact, you're only stuck at the level of bargaining and you haven't actually got into acceptance yet.
So he's psychologizing politics, basically.
Yes.
Especially neoliberal politics.
Yes, and on a collective basis, yes. So when bargaining fails, depression and withdrawal set in. And finally, after that is when you pass through the 0 point, the subject, that being any one of us who gets to that level, the subject no longer perceives the situation as a threat, but as the chance of a new beginning. And that's critical, that's important. You have to get through these stages before you can get to acceptance. You can't pass them. So his goal, or part of his goal throughout this book, is in fact to hasten people's movement through those 5 stages. He wants us to, okay, look, we're coming to an end. We got to do something. Let's get you through these stages. If you're in guilt or if you're in denial, we got to move you over to like anger. And if you're in anger, we got to move you over to bargaining. And if you're in bargaining, we got to get you over to the depression as fast as possible, because that's the only way we're going to get through this. So that's his goal essentially in this book, or that's one of the goals in this book.
So he's a psychological accelerationist.
That would work. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. So, because only once we've reached the acceptance stage will we have the courage to start to really fix the world's problems. Now, some people may look at some of the solutions and say, that's going to be tough. So, the process of this book will be to speak to the people who are in the first 4 stages and try to move them along. So, if acceptance is the goal and we're not there, then the stages of our daily life is that of the lived lie. Right? If we're not at the acceptance level, we're living a lie. To break out of which requires a continuous struggle. The starting point for this process is to become terrified of oneself.
The starting stage.
That's the starting stage, yes. We need to become terrified of oneself. And then Zizek wants to show the chain of connection of shame to terror to courage, and quotes Marx. Where does he quote Marx? A contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Apparently there he said this, and I'm quoting Marx now. I'm quoting Zizek quoting Marx. The actual burden must be made even more burdensome by creating an awareness of it. The humiliation must be increased by making it public. The people must be put in terror of themselves in order to give them the courage to do what must be done.
Hold on, do you mind 1 second? Alexi, do you mind closing the door? Do you mind closing the door? Sorry, you're kind of yelling. All right, there we go.
Okay, everything good?
Yeah.
So we must essentially become. Okay, how did we do this? Sorry, wrong one. We need to become terrified of ourselves. We must become publicly humiliated, and we must, in the terror of ourselves and our public humility, this should give us the courage to actually do what needs to be done.
So we need to be embarrassed and exposed before we can see ourselves and know what to do going forward.
Yeah, that's about half of it. He's going to give us some suggestions. Like, we may not know even then. Like, it might just be start raving terror. But yes, he's gonna help guide us through that. Okay.
Well, that's nice of him.
Sorry.
That's nice of him.
Well, he's got to do something positive, right?
Yeah.
So it's important to note that as we're dealing with people who are deluded and trying to avoid the truth, and here's this quote: "The truth we are dealing with here is not objective truth." Okay, we're not looking at facts or like 1 + 1 = 2 or anything like that. But what we are looking at is the self-relating truth about one's own subjective position. Okay, what this means is that, as such, it is an engaged truth measured not by its factual accuracy, but by the way it affects the subjective position of enunciation. In other words, we're dealing with the truth of people that determines their actions, their justifications, and their rationales. So people may have what from one perspective looks incredibly irrational, like, why would you believe that? You're crazy. But the fact that they believe that and act on it is indicative that it has a power over them, and that's the truth that we have to deal with. And that truth isn't really moved by facts. And we are all suffering from this at some degree or another.
That's definitely
some more than others.
Oh yeah.
But
you ever talk to anybody who's into like these Pizzagate or QAnon conspiracies?
Not those particular ones, but yes, I've talked to conspiracy theorists.
Oh my god, they're insanely so stupid. You give them information and they won't even look at it. They'll just call you a sheep for believing the mainstream media or some nonsense.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, by the way, do you have a link for this?
Yeah, I sent it to you. I thought I did.
I must have missed it.
Here, I'll send it to you now.
Okay.
In Facebook. Oh, maybe I posted it on mine, but I forgot to give it to you. Okay. There you go.
Thank you. Okay, put that off there. Okay, so getting back to this.
Yeah, people will be able to watch it later.
Okay, so okay, so we're dealing with the truth of subjective criteria for what makes us less anxious, and as such, facts and theories don't really help because here he's very Nietzschean here. So at one point in the book Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche starts talking about how the real criterion for truth anywhere and everywhere is pleasure, and what he means by pleasure is the reduction in feelings of anxiety or fear or that kind of stuff. So when an ideology makes you think that you've got it figured out, even if it's like a bad kind of thing that's going to happen or something, if you think that you're confident that you know what's going to happen, that gives you more pleasure, more a reduced anxiety, such that you will accept it. That it'll be very difficult for you to accept anything else, because once something has reduced your level of anxiety, changing that becomes anxious, becomes anxiety causing for you, and as such, it's very difficult to change somebody's mind. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
We're dealing with a lot of people like that, and if you're in one of these stages of grief before you get to the acceptance level, you're going to fight this. So he's not going to come directly at you and say, hey, look, this is the facts. That will never work. He's going to try and give you examples that will hopefully make you think in a slightly different way, and then you can come to that conclusion on your own. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so today we're going to deal with two. First, denial, and then anger. So his first chapter, called Denial, he refers to as the liberal utopia. He starts off with this question: why was there such a big uproar over the burqa in France, and recently in Quebec, in fact, even after he wrote this book, right? This is a symptomatic problem, he claims. It's one that is a proxy for another problem. Yes. It is symptomatic because it really is so marginal. Very, very few women in France or in Quebec insist on wearing a burqa, but the whole nation speaks about it. It is, you see something wrong with that? Like, if there's maybe, I think there were something like 11 women in Quebec that I seem to hear that had this so-called problem, that they insisted on wearing a burqa, but the whole province was talking about it, and Canada was talking about it.
Well, like, really? It's also, I mean, we see the same thing with conservatives complaining about university kids canceling comedians. I mean, and going in Twitter pylons. Like, these are the most insignificant problems compared to, you know, the real economic issues that are keeping people down.
Now, he admits that this is, because it's a symptomatic problem, it's not the real issue. So it's important to find the real issue. So most public marginal problems are symptomatic manifestations of a deeper terror, he claims that it's a terror. In the case of the burqa controversy, there is a revealing, subtle undertone of anxiety that comes from not seeing a face when one expects to. That's critical, because now the world is reversed. I mean, if we see somebody's face without a mask, we are thinking, what's the matter with you? You're dangerous to the rest of us. You got to get your mask on, right? So it doesn't even matter if it's for or against. It's one of the, he doesn't say that here, but it becomes clear as we read it on based on how COVID has changed our world today. So if we're expecting to see a person's face and we don't, it creates anxiety. If we see a person's face when we expect not to, that's going to cause anxiety too, for ideological reasons, as we're about to see. Okay, so from a Freudian perspective, the face is the ultimate mask that conceals the horror of the neighbor thing. Neighbor thing seems to be a Freudian term. He capitalizes and hyphenates it, the neighbor thing. The face is what makes the neighbor a fellow man with whom we can identify and empathize because we expect something in that face, a smile at the proper time, a greeting, a wave, or whatever, like the proper facial emotions. Because it can identify and empathize. This anxiety, this causes anxiety because it confronts us directly with the abyss of the other thing, with the neighbor in this uncanny dimension. The very covering up of the face obfuscates or creates a protective shield so that the other thing stares at us directly. When we see someone's face, we can read them, and that is comforting to think that we know their true intentions. So we reverse that. What's happening in COVID? If we see their true face, we're thinking, hey, aren't you taking COVID seriously? Are you going to cough on me or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So everybody wears a mask. Okay, I know their true intentions. They want to keep me safe. They want to keep themselves safe. I'm feeling, I understand them. Why isn't he wearing a mask?
Yeah, right. Well, just like if you're at the beach and saw someone in a thong, you'd be like, okay, whatever, they're swimming. But if you were at a gala and someone was approached you in just a thong or a banana hammock, then you would be taken aback.
Exactly, and they would cause anxiety because you're not expecting that, and that's the expectation part. Is the important part. At certain periods of time, you expect certain things, and if you don't get it, it doesn't matter what it is; it can change. So whether you have a mask or not. So at the time of his writing, when the burqa controversy was going on, very few people wore it. So it created anxiety because you expect to see a person's face. Today, it's the exact opposite. You see a person's mouth and nose, you think, well, shouldn't you have a mask on or something? Like, what's the problem? And that's the anxiety causing thing. So we're dealing with, and this is totally irrational, right? Not the mask part, but the anxiety that's being caused by this.
Well, is he discounting, racism or Islamophobia? Is he saying this is just a purely psychological phenomenon?
At this point, yes and no. So he's focusing in on that, and he's ignoring the other stuff for now. That'll come next time we do this, at a later date. But for now, he just wants to isolate the psychological aspect of it. So he doesn't say that the other part is not important, but he's giving it. He wants to move people out of denial into anger at this point. And people who are angry at people who wear a burqa, you're missing the point essentially. And he's trying to sort of open up a possibility here. So this is where ideology can save us, or rather give the nation an opportunity to vent their anxieties by doing something, anything, even if, and sometimes it's better if, it is totally unproductive. Okay? Ideology is itself this very texture of the life world which schematizes the proposition, rendering them livable. So how do you fight COVID? Let's put on a mask. Now, we know that they're not exactly very effective, but they add to the level of effect if you stay 2 meters away, plus a mask, and plus you don't go out in public if you have a cold or something like that. You're adding to it. It's never 100%, but it makes you feel better. That's like, everybody's probably going to get COVID eventually. It's not like we can stop it. It's going to be with us forever. The government has the incentive or the desire to make sure that our healthcare system does not get overwhelmed.
Our government, not the one down south. Their incentives are completely backwards.
So we might even be doing too well of a job in that respect because there's nobody in Kingston who's got it, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, we don't know exactly how deadly it is. It just looks pretty deadlier than the flu, maybe marginally, maybe a lot. We're not sure. And unlike the flu, this virus will stick around with you forever. I mean, it looks like you will be suffering with it once you get it. So,
well, for some people, not everybody, but yeah, some people it hurts it a lot more for sure.
Yeah, but I think that the latest epidemiological data or whatever is it's like AIDS or herpes or something like that. It finds a way to live within you without necessarily killing you, but making your life more less enjoyable because you're going to get sick more often.
You hear that, viewers? Don't get coronavirus. Wear your mask. You don't want this herpes It's the herpes of your lungs. You heard it here first.
Okay. So yeah, anyway, we're not even 100% sure of that, but the evidence is pointing that once you got it, you can't really get rid of
Oh
it.
God, that's terrible. All right.
It's going to live with you forever. You can like treat the symptoms like you can with AIDS and herpes and stuff like that, but you're going to get sick again, it looks like. So, by the way, this is not boding well for a vaccine. Just so you know, I mean, there's still a possibility that the vaccine won't work or that.
Well, yeah,
anyway,
they're saying the antibodies go away quickly. So
yes. So in that sense, it's almost like measles, which actually destroys antibodies and the memory of your previous diseases, right? The other one, chickenpox. Chickenpox. If you get it when you're younger, you get the vaccine. You get shingles when you get older, right? It's the same virus, so it stays with you for a very long time, for your entire life. So this is the kind of virus that apparently the coronavirus appears to be in many cases. So once you've got it forever, even if you may not be showing symptoms of it. Anyway, sorry for the bad news. Okay, so anyway, ideology can save us, or rather give the nation an opportunity to vent their anxiety by doing something productive, even if it's totally unproductive. So, I'm sorry, I read that already. Ideology is itself the very texture of the life world, which schematizes the proposition, rendering them livable. Again, we do things because it makes us feel, it reduces anxiety, and this is how we become livable. An ideology becomes livable only against the background of the obscene, unwritten rules and rituals in which it is embedded. Venting leads to action. We could ban or tolerate the burqa, which ideology, and here's the interesting thing, which ideology is more acceptable is the one that is most livable, which is the one that would reduce the anxiety the most. So I believe that in Canada, we allowed them to we made a special exemption. And I think in France, they did the opposite. I may have those two backwards. I'm pretty sure France did the opposite. They said, no, you can't do it.
Well, it was for just like using public services. You couldn't use burqa. Isn't that the rule in Quebec?
I'm puzzled by it now. I think it was that they couldn't, if they wanted to have a public job, like a school teacher, or police officer, or something like that, they couldn't wear a burqa. But for private things, they could, like getting a bus pass or something like that. I think they could. That's what I seem to remember, but I could be mistaken. But anyway, the point is, it doesn't matter what you do. The one that wins, the one that's successful, is the one that reduces the collective anxiety of the population better than the alternative. So in Canada, being a relatively sensitive people and being, very polite, we seem to have given them this dispensation. Whereas in France, being a little bit less tolerant and being a little bit more, follow the code civil, or the code Napoleonic, or whatever they call it, civil code, they imposed and said, no, you can't do that. You get out, or conform or get out. So in Quebec, it appears that was a better decision for Quebec, and it appears that may have been a better decision for France. It's hard to say, but better is relative to the reduction in anxiety is defined, I should say. Better is defined by Zizek here as the one that is better to be able to reduce the collective anxiety of the population. If you can do that, that's considered better for him. Because both of them, I mean, it's such a marginal problem. Like, really, who cares? Okay, so venting leads to action. We could tolerate the burqa, which ideology is more acceptable. Okay, sorry, I read that. The ideology we can avoid. With ideology, we can avoid thinking deeply or empathizing deeply. That's the other thing about ideology. We don't have to worry about it. I mean, it's like I just said a second ago, it's a marginal problem. Who really cares? I don't have to empathize. I'm already falling into the trap of ideology. I shouldn't say it's a trap. It's what makes life livable in a sense. It reduces my anxiety. Yeah. And collectively it does that too. So in the case of the burqa controversy, this is postmodern racism. Okay, another example would be campaigns to help starving children in Africa. There's similar examples of postmodern racism. Just act, donate money. Don't think of deeper causes or solutions, and your anxiety and your conscience will be satiated.
Yes. Yeah. So what's postmodern about this type of activism?
because that's the point of it, is to reduce the thinking as opposed to the ostensive reason to
Yes.
cure hunger or any other problem. So in the modern world, we wanted to solve problems and we usually got them wrong or made them worse in many cases. The postmodern world doesn't even try to solve the problems. We're only trying to reduce the anxiety because we have an anxiety caused world.
Right. We're changing the way we think about things instead of the
Yes.
material conditions.
Yes, it's more than that. We're hiding it from ourselves. So what he's saying here is what he believes to be the case, but most people won't see it that way. It's like, okay, yes, I will donate to during the Santa Claus toy drive or something, and it will make me feel better, and that's it. But the underlying problem, I don't have to worry about that. I'm good. That's good. Then that's what everybody does. And in fact, the most successful charities are the ones that never actually solve the problem, but get more and more money.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, because that's your income. The problem is your income. Can't solve the problem.
Yes, that's right. And that's that shift and that realization at the governance level turns it from a modern charity to a postmodern charity. Turns racism from modern racism to postmodern racism. So another, but more positive sounding example of ideology is the popularity of Tantra. You've heard of Tantra in the West?
No.
No? Tantra sex?
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that. I don't know what it is, but yeah.
So it offers the spiritual logic of late capitalism, according to Zizek. It's uniting spirituality and earthly pleasures, transcendence and material benefit, divine experience and unlimited shopping, instant gratification on the road to enlightenment. All of it, it alleviates all our anxiety so very well. Both giving and listening to opinions about the burqa and learning and practicing Tantra are examples of ideology in practice. Ideology is everywhere, and it is always practiced for the gaze of the other. Okay? So consider, for example, the behavior of Congress people during a State of the Union address. Okay? Where and when to stand up and when to clap and when not to clap is for the gaze of the other. I mean, you're not doing it because you really think the president is doing a great job or not doing a great job. You're doing it so that people can see you not doing it or doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. That is what ideology is all about. Why are you doing this? If it's for the gaze of the other, you are under ideology has you in its fullest embrace. So another example, let's see. Okay. Zizek then takes a detour to discuss two opposing views of what he calls ideology in ancient China, and concludes that this is a quote, the two opposing theories of Confucianism and legalism share a deeply materialistic premise. For both of them, the truth of ideology does not matter. It is not even implied that ideological myths are beautiful lies, which is what Plato would have done. What matters is how ideological myth and rituals function in their role in sustaining the social order. So he's basically claiming that this has been around for thousands of years in China, and by extension, he's saying it's been everywhere. The rulers have not really cared about the myths and legends of their time. They've only cared insofar as they are useful for maintaining their rule or their social order. So that entire chapter is dedicated to examples of how the world is set up and has always been set up to help us avoid real objective truth and to accept ideology as a substitute because it is more socially harmonious and therefore more pleasant. This is Zizek's way of trying to bring us out of denial. Now, you can decide for yourself if it actually works or what. But he's basically saying the world is ideological. You're stuck in it.
Yep.
And you're denying it. Yeah, we know that.
So you have to accept that it is ideological and that you are ideological.
Yes, exactly. Then before going on to chapter 2, he puts an interlude here, and he calls it Hollywood Today, a report from an ideological battlefield. And it's sort of like a half chapter interlude. So Zizek dedicates himself to looking at popular Hollywood movies. And his main thesis here is that one of the best ways to detect shifts, even if they're just subtle shifts in the ideological constellation of any particular time, is to compare consecutive remakes of the same story. So to this end, he talks a lot about Batman and the Joker and other remakes, but spends most of the time on the 4 versions of I Am Legend. Have you seen the movie I Am Legend with Will Smith?
Yes.
Yes, it's the 4th
Didn't know
version
that.
of the story. So the first, being in 1954, it was is a novel by Richard Matheson. It was first made into a film in 1964, and it was called The Last Man on Earth. Then a second version in 1961 called The Omega Man. And finally in 2007, a version called I Am Legend, back to the original book title, starring Will Smith. So he goes on and talks about how in the first movie, the main character is revealed to be a legend to a race of vampires. Okay, this is a role reversal with modern vampire stories, right? The vampire is usually the legend, and we discover that. Apparently in the first one, there's vampires are everywhere, and hey, there's a human. Oh my God,
They're real.
They're real. How did that happen? All right, like these guys can walk in the light or something. I don't know, whatever. Yeah. I haven't read the story.
Daywalkers.
Something like that. Yeah. So that's a bit of the role reversal, and he points out that. It's okay. Sorry. Role reversal. It seems perhaps that the ideology expressed was meant to give vent to the anxieties of the nuclear age and the sexual revolution of the 1960s. That's his take on it. But in the second, this is the 1971 movie. Where is it? Sorry. In the second, the ideology gives vent to the anxieties of technology, as the main antagonists are all afraid of the technology of the main character in the Omega Man. So in this world, the Omega Man is like a god. He's got technology that nobody else has. Right? That's what the creators of this movie felt was important to say. And then last, sorry?
Why would that be specific to the 70s?
Yes.
Or why would that be?
I didn't put that down. Anxieties of technology as the main antagonist. So I guess the development of the development of the jet age, moving into like commercial jets, the Cold War, the realization of nuclear war as being a possibility there. I'm grasping at straws here. I'm sorry.
Satellites, rockets, yeah. Space travel. Yeah. Computers.
Yeah, that's right. Computers were invented by that time in 1971. Or they were like some really super futuristic kind of stuff because you saw them in movies, right?
Yeah.
All right. So maybe that had something to do with it. So in the, where is it? Sorry. In the second, the ideology gives vent to the anxieties of technology. Okay. So in the last film, Will Smith's character makes a Christ-like sacrifice of himself to save a woman and child who will be able to save the world. So apparently there were 2 versions of this movie, and I'm not sure if that's the director's cut or the original one, but he sacrifices himself for their benefit, and they get to some colony, and they have the serum that will save the world. So what does this mean? In 2007, it's openly adopting for a religious fundamentalism. This is an attitude that is needed to maintain the war on terror and foreign military engagements today. I Am Legend by Will Smith helped prop up the military-industrial complex and the wars on terror, is what he's claiming. A subtle, it's not obvious, it's a subtle, Iraq or wherever they send you. And that's kind of needed today. So he feels that this movie was very propagandistic and very full of ideology in that respect. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure if I completely buy that one, but I mean, I suppose I could be convinced in reading his book. But
You're reading this?
sorry.
You say you're reading this book?
No, if I were to read his book, I mean, I
If
might.
you were, okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, he claims that the ideology is meant to serve the interests of the ruling class, and in this case, it was to maintain a war on terror. And so the most popular ones, I shouldn't say the most popular ones, the ones that are promoted the most by the biggest money and the biggest powers that be, in this case Hollywood, are pushing that, and the ones that are not tend to be relegated to, like, Cannes or something like that, or fringe festivals.
Yeah, well, yeah, they push the idea of American militarism and the need for military spending, outside threats, America's the policeman, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So ideology shifted to help people deal with changes in the world and to make the changes seem reasonable, comfortable, and known without having to think through them. That's the important thing, without having to think through them.
Right.
Just like all those other charities and stuff. All right, and that was the end of the first chapter and half chapter. Then he goes on to anger. Remember, this is now directed at people who are angry, and he needs to get them into bargaining. So starts off by, the chapter is called Anger, the Actuality of the Theologico-Political. We'll see what that means shortly, okay? So according to Lacan, Jacques Lacan, one of his mentors and a psychologist, the fundamental subjective position of fantasy is to be reduced to a gaze observing the world in the condition of the subject's non-existence. Okay, that's a mouthful,
yeah,
right? So let's say it again.
Mean?
Okay, so fantasy. When you're in a state of fantasy, or when you're imagining something, real or in your mind only, there is this position where you're not really there, but you are. You're sort of like a disembodied person. So anytime you're watching TV, you're in this fantasy world. Nobody's watching you, but you get to watch.
Right.
You're being reduced to a gaze, watching, without you actually existing in the TV. I mean, you're not there. You're just watching. But it's not only TV. If you've ever dreamt or wanted to witness your own funeral, like what would people say about you at your funeral? You're engaging in that fantasy because you're dead. You're not there. But you still could know, and they wouldn't know that you're not dead. Everybody who's there has to understand that you're dead, yes, and believe it, so they can't see you. So if you've ever wondered what people would say at your funeral, you're engaging in this fundamental fantasy.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Another example that he gives is nature documentaries. You're not there, right? Or a type of zoo. Apparently there are zoos out there in which the spectators are put into a vehicle and they go into the natural world of the animal, like in the safari or something like that. And the humans are in the zoo or in the cages, and they're looking at the wild animals outside. This is an example of trying to actually live that gaze, because the animals often don't really notice you and don't care because they don't see you as a threat or as food. That's living the fantasy as well. So this phenomenon seems to be linked to a growing popularity of Darwinistic reductions of human society to animal ones, with their explanation of human achievement in terms of evolutionary adaptation. So we are successful because we have this evolutionary adaptation, whatever it might be. So white skin. We lived up in the cold areas of the north where there's lots of snow. Adaptation, and hey, guess what? We conquered the world, so it's got to be good. That kind of thinking, that it's really quite racist, that particular example, is that fantasy. It's an example of that fantasy in theory as opposed to in actuality. Okay? The popularity of nature documentaries and evolutionary biological explanations provide a glimpse into a utopian world where no language or training are needed. it provides a glimpse into a harmonious society in which everyone spontaneously knows his or her roles. Now, in contrast to that, to this harmonious society, we live in a society with all its problems. So what if, and here's a second example of this in theory, what if the world were different? So what if histories are part of a general ideological trend of a perception of life that explodes the form of the linear, centered narrative and renders it in a multiform flow. So he's saying there's a lot of popularity, a lot of series that came out recently about how the world would be different if, say, the Nazis won, or if witches were real, and if the Salem witch trials hadn't happened, or something like that. Yeah. What if witches were at West Point, right, and became weaponized by the United States? Or
counterfactual like history or whatever.
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Alternative history, yeah.
Yes. Having opened up these possibilities of thought, one can more easily think backwards, meaning one can consider what would have been if a decision in one's life had been made differently. This can be particularly lamentable or traumatic for social and environmental activists who may focus on past failures. Now, the point what he's saying here is that it's all ideology, and we are living a fantasy. We're even imagining a fantasy because it's better than the reality.
Yes.
One other example, this is also connected to the anger thing. He wants to say that pen names or nom de guerre are useful fictions for the ideological key to a real war criminal. Okay, so he's looking at the poetry of Dragan Dabic, I think that's how you pronounce it, also known as Radovan Karadzic. Are you familiar with this guy? He was like a genocidal guy in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Yeah. I've heard of this.
Serbian. Yeah. I think he had something to do with like the massacre at Srebrenica or something like that. But he was a poet, and he was hiding in plain sight for many, many years after the war. And he became like a guru, a self-help guru for a while before he was actually eventually caught, or they had enough of him or something. But he was the thing that interested Zizek was that it was his poetry. And the simple outright dismissal of a war criminal's poems as propaganda or for show is, in Zizek's mind, a lost opportunity to recognize our common humanity. And he says it's not for the sake of sympathy, but rather as a warning of how we could also easily become a war criminal too under the right circumstances, right?
So the poet's art could give us a glimpse into our own souls, I guess, or at least what's possible.
Yeah. So that's only the first stage. So just to be clear, a lot of people say, "Oh, he wrote that. He's a war criminal." Excuse me. Not interested at all. He's saying that's pretty petty of you. I mean, you could at the very least understand that you could become like him too if you like the poetry, for example. But from an anger perspective, when you're trying to convince people to move on from anger to the next stage, it's also an opportunity to catch a glimpse of what he calls the poetico-military complex. Poetry in the service of the military complex, the poetico-military complex. All right, so he's using poetry with military complex. And how ethnic cleansing functions. Okay, so pardon?
That's an interesting concept. Go on.
Yeah. So poetry at the service of the military industrial complex allows, and here's his quote, the super ego's suspension of moral prohibitions. This is the critical feature of today's postmodern nationalism. Nationalism's fundamentalism serves as the operator of a secret, barely concealed "you may." Without full recognition of this perverse, pseudo-liberating effect of contemporary nationalism, of how the obscenely permissive superego supplements the explicit texture of the social symbolic law, we condemn ourselves to misunderstanding its true dynamic. poetry that says love of your country is implicitly saying that anybody who doesn't love your country has something wrong with them. And in so doing, it allows you to overcome that. Like, most people have this feeling that you shouldn't kill other people, you shouldn't harm other people. But as a result of this edifying poetry, and it could be movies, it could be actual poetry, it could be songs, or it could be traditions and that kind of stuff. It allows you to suspend your superego that says, don't be killing people, don't be hurting people. In this case, it's okay. You may do that. Go ahead and commit genocide.
Yes, yes. And this time it's okay. Those people are bad.
Yes.
You're right.
Yeah. Exactly. And this is something Plato was talking about. We want that kind of stuff in our state, so we get people who behave properly for the benefit of the state. But if the benefit of the state means that they're allowed to go and commit genocide against the next adjacent city state, he's saying this has been happening for thousands of years. Poetry or art at the service of genocide, and nowadays in the service of nationalism. Nationalism is like only about 200 or 300 years old. It's important that we recognize that, and that suspension of our superego, that suspension of what our normal morals are. So people who think they'll never be able to kill anybody, or they could never kill anybody, they couldn't live with themselves. No, poetry allows them to have a reason that they could live with themselves, saying those people were different somehow. And I Am Legend is one way to do that. Like, I better sacrifice myself for the sake of a better, higher good that my nation tells me is. Like, let's go invade Afghanistan.
Now, okay, makes sense a little more.
Okay. So, without full recognition of this perverse pseudo-liberating effect, sorry, I read that. So, love and hatred, peace and war coexist. Zizek then contrasts the message of love with one of the most difficult to understand passages in the New Testament. And here he's talking about Matthew 10:34 and Luke 12:49 for any bibliophiles there, where Jesus claims to have come not to bring peace, but a sword, to set generation against generation. Okay, if you're familiar with the Bible, at this point, Jesus is saying, I'm not here to bring peace, I'm here to bring a sword, and you will be fighting against your father and your mother, and on and on and on. It's hard for many Christians to read that, and you can imagine why, because they concentrate on the love part. But he's saying that is love. Okay, that's important to understand, that is in fact love. It's a surprisingly common juxtaposition, he points out. In the revolutionary writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Che Guevara, it's everywhere apparently. And here's his claim. Che Guevara's claim that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love should be read together with his much more problematic statement on revolutionaries as killing machines. Here's Che Guevara talking about how revolutionaries should be moved by love and be killing machines.
He said you should be a killing machine?
He said, okay, this is Zizek's quote, and he's linked together several quotes of Che Guevara. So within the quote of Zizek, he says that Che Guevara said, where does it say? The true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. Then Zizek's words say, should be read together with the more problematic, and there's statement on revolutionaries as, and then he just quotes killing machines that apparently Che Guevara also said.
Okay.
All right. So,
Che didn't actually end up killing that many people, but I mean, against the Batista regime, some of those guys, you can definitely understand how that could be a good thing.
Right. But here you have somebody, you should be motivated by love, but you should also be a killing machine. Doesn't sound compatible, but Zizek is saying it's very compatible. In fact, a point of revolutionary writing, such as the New Testament, such as the Bible, where Jesus is said to, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword, is to destroy the existing world and usher in a new one. Agape, which is the universal Christian love, is the revolutionary love of and for a better world. But the bringing about of a new world for the sake of love is terror inspiring, meaning love must be potentially terrible because if it's not, it's impotent. His words.
Right. Every revolution is in some sense terrible. Uh, to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, there was terror in each of those, but
Yes,
they
there
needed to
were.
happen.
Yes. And there's a certain terror in Christianity, or what he would say is more authentic Christianity. And this is because it's revolutionary. Once it's not revolutionary, there's no terror. Then you either solved all problems or you've lost the revolution. So, and then he asks you to consider disciplining kids. All right. So consider disciplining one's children and taking aside the fact that spanking is not considered good today, but that spanked kids can be good and non-spanked kids can turn out badly. I mean, it happens. Whatever form of discipline one chooses, there is always a level of violence in any imposition, even if it's just taking something away. So in this sense, the art of parenting is to discipline without ruining the child, to impose some level of violence. Parents who fail to socialize their children have, in a sense, failed to apply the proper level of violence. Likewise, with all social and activist movements today, their failure is a result of not being violent enough. And he quotes this in the other book on violence, right?
We're not directed in the right manner.
Pardon?
We're not directed in the right manner.
Yes, and that could be the problem with not being violent enough. I mean, if you direct the violence in the wrong direction, it's wasted in a sense.
Yeah.
There is still a lot of violence perpetrated in the world, even and especially when the struggle is labeled non-violent. So Gandhi's successful non-violent campaign had a very violent tendency to disrupt the British colonial government through breaking the law. So consider he burnt his identity card in South Africa, civil disobedience and non-cooperation, and disrupting economic activity, such as his deliberate breaking of the law in his march to the sea to collect sea salt and avoid paying the British to do it. Gandhi's genius, according to Slavoj Zizek, was that he found an acceptable level of violence that won the day. Okay? So Gandhi, from his perspective, was not a non-violent kind of guy. He may have preached that because that was part of his ideology, that was part of his message, but he was very violent. And what he's saying is that he had just the right amount of violence to win, not more, not gratuitous. And he even labeled it non-violent, but it was violent. A failed revolution didn't achieve that level of violence that it needed to win.
In principle, I agree, but I think historically, Gandhi's role has been kind of overblown. I don't like his pacifism alone didn't. It's hard to say actually made a difference, but I mean symbolically, it's. You could argue well, actually, I don't know.
I think he made a pretty big difference on his own, yes. But we can disagree on that on a different day. The point is that Zizek admires Gandhi and says the guy's a genius, a brilliant revolutionary, didn't have to go to the excesses of the Bolshevik Revolution and achieved his end. But he was violent. To say that he was non-violent is only to accept his ideology, his propaganda, if you will. Gandhi was, in a sense, or maybe others around him were propagandist geniuses. They labeled his revolution as non-violent. It wasn't. It was just the right amount. And it had a very successful propaganda campaign. So the failure of environmental, feminist, social, and democratic activists today is that they have been unwilling to deploy sufficient violence to get the job done. So what we need today, according to Zizek, is a theological, political suspension of the ethico-legal. So if you have religious and political overcoming of ethical and legal tradition, in a sense. All successful movements have broken the ethics and the law of the time with a call to a higher power or to a higher truth or to higher ideals. So that's why those higher ideals are theological versus ethical. Ethical is what's considered ethical in the particular society. Theological is an appeal to something higher than what the society says. And the political, of course, is the force that's involved, whereas the legal is the procedure. And we have to get rid of the ethical legal with a theological political suspension. In this is the line with all success. This is in line with all successful revolutions. So he names the Haitian, the American, the French, and the Russian, and movements such as the suffragettes, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. What this means for neighborly relations is that the safe distance that habit and social norms have kept is under threat of rupture. So if you're not used to having, like your example, you talked about at the beach, it's okay to see a thong, but not so much at a ball. That safety, that expected neighborly relations is under threat in any revolution. And this will bring the neighbor too close, usually violently. And then the difference will be traumatic. In other words, when you change the ethical, legal expectations of society, it's going to be traumatic for anybody and everybody in that society. But this necessitates a new distancing, a new social norm that sets the new boundaries. And this is what the goal of this is a task of any revolution. You have to destroy the existing expectations and set up new ones, according to Zizek. Zizek gives an example of how in America, it's okay to ask about one's sexual identity. It's much less pleasant to do that in Europe. And Zizek, as a European in the US, was asked about his sexual identity. And he claims that he would marginally prefer to have answered questions about his income and his net wealth, knowing full well that such questions are far too intrusive in the US. So
right.
He's saying, like, you ask a European, are you gay or are you straight? Do you have a little bit of trans in you? And it's like, don't ask that. What are you, crazy? It's better to ask, how much money do you make? What is your T4 number, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which we would look at it and say, you don't ask that. You never ask that. I mean, how much you make? No, that's just too private.
Right.
So these are the difference in norm. These are just two examples of difference in norms that at some point, when Europeans and Americans interact, they often clash. And it's like, don't ask me that. What are you? Kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Cultural norms.
So he ends this chapter with another interlude, which he calls reverberations of the crisis in a multi-centric world. Okay, so in this one, Zizek ends by considering Zionism and anti-Semitism. He starts by condemning anti-Semitism as the evil and racism it is. But what has been missing in the analysis is where we find anti-Semitism and what its function is in the modern world. So he claims that the meaning of the term Jew in its anti-Semitic context has shifted in the last 200 years. So for while most of the last 2,000 years, a Jew was a member of a religion who displayed certain Jewish characteristics. In the 19th century, the notion of Jew became a being, a type of person, a human, a being. And here's his quote. It was then, precisely when the specific figure of the Jew disappeared, that the absolute Jew emerged. A transformation which conditioned the shift of anti-Semitism from theology to race. So insofar as the Jews were identified by a series of properties, the goal was to convert them. This was the Christian goal, was to convert them, turn them into Christians. But once Jewishness concerned their very being, then only annihilation could solve the Jewish question. That's his claim. Hitler could not have done the Jewish question without the Jewish people having first been turned into beings,
Right.
as opposed to members of religion. It's
Right.
like
It wasn't
today,
ideas. It was, yeah, or a type of a religion. It was the people themselves, the race.
yes, yes. So it's similar today. I'm I grew up Christian, and I could become anything else I want. If I wanted to convert to Islam or to Shinto or whatever, it's possible for me to do that. But if I were to become labeled as being Christian, as opposed to the figure of speech, I'm a Christian, being Christian, then I can't, because you're Christian. It's like saying you're a man. You can't really change that, or I guess you can now, but it's like saying you're white. You can't change that. And once that happens, there's no salvation, in the sense that the final solution is what happens. So he's saying that we must always fight against labeling anybody some sort of being. And racism is particularly bad, because if you're black, you're black.
So is
You're white, you're white.
Is he talking about essentialism then, in general?
Yes. Yes, but this is in a sense. This is in a. Yes. Okay. Yes. He is. Essentialism is a much older concept, but what he's talking about is the application of it to a religious group and changing it from properties. Like I believe in the Hasidic commandments of the Torah or whatever, to I'm Jewish. It's in my DNA, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Right.
Just in my being, yeah.
Yeah. That shift is very dangerous, and the Holocaust is an example of the extreme dangerousness of that. But we are doing it constantly to ourselves, when in racist dialogues, when we say you're white, when we label somebody as white, you can't change that, right? So when you label somebody as black, you can't change that. Now, we hope that it's never going to go to a genocide again, but it makes it so much easier to get to a genocide when somebody can't change out of that, compared to when they can. So as a Christian, let's say you want to convert somebody to Christianity, it's much easier to let them live and become Christian than it is to kill them, because they can convert. But if you know that they cannot convert because their skin color, they can't change their skin color or something like that, then it becomes easier to eliminate them, because and it's easier to justify. It's God's work or something. So, and again, this is what I understand Zizek is saying. I'm not personally saying this. He's basically saying we do, and this I do agree with, we do not want to label people in terms of being. We may want to assign properties to them, but not properties of being. So a Jewish person, he felt, was a lot safer prior to the 19th century, when they were viewed as having a religion that they practiced, and that could be changed. So, but changing that over time to they are Jewish and they can't change, was a very bad thing for them, and it could be for anybody else that suffers under, or that gets labeled that way.
Yeah, we see the same thing with like Islamophobia, which is kind of a weird term, but yeah, it's the people really talking about a race instead of ideas.
Yes. And Islam is also susceptible to this, partly because once you're Muslim, you can't not be Muslim. I mean, you become the worst of all person. Like, you've seen the truth and you are no longer that.
Right.
Because Catholicism
Infidel.
was like that in like the 16th century, right? Anybody who converted away from Catholicism was like, oh my God, you're
right. That's
you're
worse. That's worse than being, a native savage. It's worse than being a savage and not knowing.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So so essentially what he's fighting against is the making a being out of somebody, what he called the absolute Jew here. So therefore, to fight the genocidal tendencies of racism and discrimination, no group must ever be thought of as being their properties, gay and trans people, for example. This is how anti-Semitism works today. it is not we who have anything, and here he's speaking sort of like as a racist. He's like, it's not we who have anything against the Jews. It's just the way the Jews themselves actually are. So that's how racists are saying it today.
Yeah.
Like, I know a lot of Jews. Some of my best friends are Jews. It's just how they are. That's about as racist as you can get in the more modern racist sense.
That's right.
And he says, you gotta call that out at every opportunity because it's just wrong. So it's so yeah, that's that. He was like pretending to be racist there, and he's saying this is how racists act. The implication is that so here, and this, it's harder to see because I wrote this in with parentheses in the right place. So the sentence goes without the parentheses. The implication is that they are unchangeable because of who they are. But the truth of it is that we are unchangeable because of who we are, and we're not letting them change, making us the racists, right? So it sounds again like they are unchangeable because of who they are, but the reality is it's the racist who can't change. So he looks over there and says, no, they can't change. Nope. But look, they changed. No, you misunderstand. That's just an act. So what it is what he's saying is essentially the racist is externalizing his inability to change onto them, onto the victim. All right. And saying they can't change. But in reality, what he's saying is, I can't change. I'm not going to change. No way. They're whatever they are.
They're projecting.
Yes. That could be also, yes, that's a very good way to say it. Therefore, the real philosophical fight against discrimination, of which racism is an example, and anti-Semitism an example of racism, is to fight the becoming and identifying with one's characteristics. That's the fight, according to Zizek. Now, he mitigates this recently after Black Lives Matter. I saw it in the video, but I think he still believes this, but he needs to go further. Huh. So he gives another example. Anti-Semitism is a symptomatic fixation, avoiding the real problems in the societies where it most emerges. Okay, and now there's going to be a switch here in a second. There's going to be like a major switch, but let's hear that again. Anti-Semitism is a symptomatic fixation. So you're fixating on its anti-Semitism, avoiding the real problems in the societies where it most emerges. So of course, many of the Arab countries around Israel who have a problem with Israel have a lot of anti-Semitism. They're using that to avoid the real problems in their own society. Everybody knows that, so he's not going to talk about that. Zizek instead dives into Zionist anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Does that sound like a contradiction?
Yeah, it does.
Zionist anti-Semitism.
Let's hear it.
He looks at a now defunct website, which at the time, and I tried to look it up, it's defunct now too, Masada2000.org. Okay, and here he's quoting the website. He's quoting partly from what it says in the website, which contained a self-proclaimed dirt list of more than 7,000 shit Jews. Shit is in capital letters, and it stands for self-hating Israel threatening. Okay, this was a Zionist website. Okay,
so left-wing Jews, basically.
Yeah. There is clearly no need, and here he goes, there's clearly no need to search out in Arab propaganda to find examples of brutal anti-Semitism today. Fanatical Zionists are themselves doing the job perfectly adequately. That is, Zionism itself, in its hatred of Jews who do not fully identify with the policies of the State of Israel, paradoxically became anti-Semitic and constructed the figure of the Jew who doubts the Zionist project along anti-Semitic lines. Meaning that anti-Semitism in Israel and around the world by Jews against Jews is a cover-up for real problems in Israel.
As it is everywhere else.
Yes,
Right.
as it is everywhere else.
So
So
it's like
even
the eternal Jew is the enemy of everyone, including the Jews,
yes,
as a stand-in for capitalism, more or less.
yes, and that would be an example. Yes, and there's many of these kind of examples, but he spends a lot of time on the Jewish-Palestinian question.
Ben
So,
Shapiro, by the way, viewers,
pardon?
Ben Shapiro, by the way, viewers, is a good example of this.
Okay.
He's a right-wing Jew who talks about the bad Jews who don't act like properly when he's talking about left-wing Jews,
Okay.
because he is the
So,
Pope of the Jews.
mm-hmm. So Zizek continues on. There's an extreme danger or a small opportunity in the Zionist project. So very big extreme danger, but there is a small opportunity. Unfortunately, it's more likely that the extreme danger is going to manifest itself, but there's a small opportunity. So while paying lip service to the two-state solution, Israel is creating a situation on the ground which will render a two-state solution, impossible. All right, so the two-state solution is long gone. We're still talking about it. It's not going to happen. Meaning there will not be a two-state solution. The fact is that there is one state of Israel that controls all of Palestine, all Palestinian territories, with apartheid-like racial segregation. So the true fight is against apartheid in the existing one state of Israel. So this is not to say that the Palestinian people must not continue the violent struggle, because sometimes a little bit of intolerance is necessary in order to create more room for tolerance. Like, he's not saying the Palestinians got to stop fighting. What happens in Israel when the Palestinians do nothing is that nothing less than the slow but incessant process of the Israelis taking land from the Palestinian on the West Bank, gradually strangling the Palestinian economy. This is what happens when there's no violence. And it's all supported by a Kafkaesque, I love this word.
Kafkaesque.
Kafkaesque. So from Kafka, if you've, I've only read synopses of like The Castle and The Trial and a few others.
I've heard this word before, though.
It's ridiculous. It's like the bureaucracy has gone out of control, and everything is ridiculous. So this is all supported by a Kafkaesque network of legal regulations. It really fits in this particular case. This is the fundamental reality which makes all abstract prayers for peace obscene and hypocritical. So many churches pray for peace in the Middle East. He thinks that he just does face plants when he does that. It's obscene because peace is bad for the Palestinians, because they're just going to get strangled more. It's like peace, like when his idea of violence is below the zero level where people don't see it as being very, very violent. It's what's happening to the Palestinians right now, and their only opportunity, or their only way of speaking out, is by being violent, because nobody's listening to them if they're not. That's the situation in the world, and he's explaining why. Peace, the zero level of violence, is an ethical, legal, invisible, insidious, and incessant violence. It happens, but it's not seen. Israeli settlers and other extremists legitimate the zero level of violence by Israel's quote-unquote honest prohibitions. He goes on to say that the condemnation of non-state anti-Palestinian violence obfuscates the true problem of state violence. So the emphasis is on the rock throwers, the Palestinian youth who are throwing rocks at tanks, and they do nothing. They're going to lose everything, so they speak out, and then they emphasize, hey, they attacked us first. They attacked at a level that is easily recognizable as violence, and then they respond back with violence as well and say they're justified. What people fail to see is that the violence that happened below that zero level is strangling the Palestinians. They're not violent because they want to be, like, it's not like they're warlike or anything like that. It's like they're being forced to by the situation that's there. And here's the situation as it looks like from the where is it? On the ground. Here's the situation on the ground. The condemnation of non-state anti-Palestinian violence obfuscates the true problem of state violence. The condemnation of illegal settlements obfuscates the illegality of the legal ones. Therein resides the two-faced nature of the much-praised honesty of the Israeli Supreme Court. by occasionally passing a judgment in favor of the dispossessed Palestinians, now and then proclaiming their evictions illegal, it guarantees the legality of the remaining vast majority of cases. So they're taking land here, and somebody gets a little bit too aggressive, and so they get taken to court, and they lose that. But all the other ones pass. So all it does is it just keeps the creep going, right? And there's a wink, wink. Hey, we know we're supporting you. You're going too fast, and we just need an example to show how just we are. That's below the zero level of violence, and that people don't see it that way is what troubles him. So Zizek then does a similar analysis of events in China, Haiti, the Congo, the US, and Europe. Racism is the symptom for deeper problems that creates problems more easily solved if one realizes the problem is in the structures of late capitalism. Ideology is what blinds people to the fact and to the obvious solutions. Now, the obvious solutions we won't get to until next time. But that essentially is the introduction and first 2 chapters. There's 3 chapters left to go, and we're about halfway done.
Okay. All right. Well, that's.
And that was almost 2 hours.
Oh yeah! Wow, that was a long way. Well, we started at 9:30, so hour and a half.
But yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, it's a big book, though, eh?
Yeah. But it's got big writing. In any case, yeah. So in the next time we will do the 3 remaining stages of grief: bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And hopefully we'll see what what his version of an ideal communist world at the end of it will be.
Okay. Could you just before we go, could you just sum up that second chapter for me again, so I make sure I understand?
So you're dealing with people who are angry. So in order to deal with, to make people move over into the next one, bargaining, point out that the anger that people are feeling, maybe you in particular, because you're at this level, is everywhere. Everybody's got it. And here's why. It's in the structures of capitalism.
Right. There's something, you're not wrong for being angry. You're just, it's built in.
It's going to, yeah. Yes, essentially. That kernel of that idea needs to be put into your mind, because if you remain angry, that's not progress. You got to move on to the next one so we can get to acceptance.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks, Jeff.
My pleasure.
Until next time, 2 weeks from now.
Sounds good.
All right. See you then. Bye, everybody.
All right. All the best.